Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the history of online poetry as I know it myself. Um, I have found out about online poetry from a friend of mine named Art Paul Slasher. He is a pretty famous street musician locally in Madison, Wisconsin. He tends to perform outdoors along State Street between the Capitol and the University building. Uh, Art Paul is otherwise known as a busker. He's hilarious. He's funny. He's a really great guy, and I've known him since high school. Uh, he told me about this website called www.lightburst.com. I want to say somewhere around 1996, 97, right around in there. On lightverse.com, I started reading poetry. I had already written a little bit. I decided to start trying my hand at a few poems, and I wrote poetry on lightverse.com, and it turned into 1,800 or so poems eventually. There was also another friend of mine from online chat forums named Jeanine Daniel at online. She went by Spinny. She was also a poet and a visual artist. We ended up being friends for 21 years. She just passed away this past week, 1996 through 2017, so 21 years. Yeah, long time. Lightverse.com was always my favorite site for building an archive of online poetry. I had set my account on there to where it would email every poem to me as it was published on the site. I thought I had copies of it all, but it turns out the copies were all on an older computer that's sitting dead in the closet. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to recover that stuff off the hard drive because it was in Netscape Communicator email. A lot of stuff is on other poetry boards online. There's one called Mystic Muse. There's another one that I go to that's Poetic Constellations. There's another one that I used to do a lot called Flowing Quills. Their Crossroads forum was their general poetry forum. Um, there's so many other poets out there that write on these boards, especially the Yuku.com boards and the Pro boards, free forums. Some very talented writers, pretty amazing writers. And they really started doing this in the mid to late 90s. It really started getting going, you know, as computer technology, PC technology became affordable. Oh, man, it would have to happen right in the middle of the video. Okay, anyway, 90s dial-up internet. Everybody had it. But poems were something you could put out pretty quick. And you'd be surprised how many people appreciate poetry and write it well. And some of these folks have been practicing online. I know poets, Curtis Parker, Blueberry Kitten. I've known him almost as long as I've known Jeanine. There's several other too. And, you know, with practice comes some form of perfection. This isn't necessarily your traditional poetry. It's not form poetry. It's late at night. I'm having to do this at 2 o'clock in the morning. It's not form poetry. Some people do forms, but it's much more free verse. And it gets pretty amazing and pretty deep. I know there's so many poets online, so many good poets online. And there are sites like Poem Hunter and Shadow Poetry, and of course there's like self-published poetry anthologies. Lulu.com, I've got 5 chapbooks published on there. So those poems aren't lost for sure. I've also started up a blog called Spellbook on blogger.com, and I've been recovering a lot of my old poetry from the discussion forums and posting them on Spellbook. And my Spellbook blog, I've got poetry set to publish every day all the way through September 9th, I think September 8th or 9th of this year. And I haven't finished recovering all the poetry by any means. I have a lot more to go. You know, but thankfully a lot of it was on multiple forums, and the thing is, a few of these forums have turned into kind of ghost towns. I call it like the wild, wild west, you know, right after the mining era and right before we got into the modern era, how the wild, wild west became not so much in a lot of mining towns, dried up and blew away and became just old ghost towns out in the desert. Well, some of the poetry boards have turned into that. I still go to a couple of them. I'm a moderator, but not an admin on those. So I can't really take them over and administer them because I'm not an admin. I can do some functions being a moderator. And of course, I can still post new posts. And I do because there's a lot of poetry stored on those. There's a lot of poetry saved in these ghost town poetry boards. And some of the poets are gone. I can think of 5 poets off the top of my head that have passed away in the last 5 years. Christine Duran, aka Talitha Ruatha, Maggie, aka Kusik, Jeanine this past week, aka Spinning, Ivor, aka Poetic Piers, and John, aka Willowdown. That's just off the top of my head. I know there have been a few other ones. Oh, and one of the lightverse.com poets, Hope Smith. That's not her real name. She lived in Perth, Australia. She died about 7, 8 years ago now. Her poetry was up on lightverse.com. I still have an archive of her personal website around somewhere. With Jeanine's poetry, only about 4 of her poems are still online. Jeanine and I were friends offline as well, via email. I mean, she lived in Brisbane, Australia. I lived in the Chicago area and then California the last couple of years. So we never got to meet in person, but we were friends for 21 years online. Email, you know, every 2 or 3 months, long time. Facebook friends. We had done a couple of collaboration poems that won awards on various poetry sites. And for a while, Jeanine was under a lot of stress with all the poetry boards and keeping up her website online and stuff like that. She kind of went under the radar for a while. Stopped doing much poetry. Focused more on her visual art, and she was also a pretty decent singer from what I understand. She did karaoke with friends, and she did a lot of that. But anyway, for a while, when she was a little bit incommunicado, I had backed up 2/3 of her website and every poem she had on lightverse.com, which thankfully there was only about 280, you know, of her poem, 285, 283, 286, something like that. I backed up copies of all of that, and I mailed it to her, physical postal mail on CD, so that she'd have a copy, and I've kept it just backed up as an archive on my hard drive because it just doesn't take up that much space. So I'll be mailing physical copies of that to her family in Australia I don't have like an email address where I can share it with the family. See, this is the interesting thing about internet poetry. It's not only there's the ghost towns, there's the poetry boards that have been around since the 90s. There's the Internet Archive where a lot of poets have saved stuff. There's little obscure poetry boards around I don't know the status of again. And when the Iraq War came along, there was one called Poets Against the War, where hundreds of poets contributed poems in opposition to the Iraq War, which we now know was a horrible mistake. So internet poetry really came of age in the mid to late 90s. And it kind of peaked in the early 2000s, and it's gone through a little bit of a decline, I think. But it's not gone, not by any means. It's still accessible, and there's a rich history there, but a lot of these poets are starting to pass away. I mean, they were in their, what, 30s and 40s, maybe even 50s, back in the golden age, as I like to call it, of web poetry. And I'm concerned that a lot of the long-term history of the early days of internet poetry are going to be lost because of this. I think it's a story worth telling. I think it's compelling. I think it's work worth preserving. I think there is a uniqueness to it in the sense that internet poetry crosses international boundaries. I've written and commented with poets from India, Russia, the UK, Australia, maybe even one or two in Latin America. I'm not so certain that one of them might have been in Africa at one point. And it's a unique online culture that crosses global boundaries. Internet poetry is kind of mapless. It's, there's no map lines on the actual Earth. They're just on man-made little globes you spin in your hand, or maps, or Google Maps, or whatever. But the actual Earth doesn't have those lines on it. They're a state of mind rather than actual divisions. They're human social constructs and cultural divisions and legal divisions, which is just another state of mind. So this was one culture that was truly global and still is. I mean, web poetry hasn't gone away by any means. It still exists. But the early days when it was being born and when it was really starting to flourish, I think it's worth capturing that. And I think it's worth doing the work to preserve those poets' legacy online. Because there have been sites that have gone down for lack of funding. They were just private people that had put up these websites. Lightverse.com was put up by a fellow named Eric Perkins, who worked for Monster.com, and this was a hobby site that he built on the side when, as practice. And of course, he wrote poetry as well, so it was a minor passion of his, hobby. And he sold it off to a fellow named Fred Schraff. And Fred had the hosting costs got too expensive for him, and he had to let it go. So Lightverse.com has been down for about 2.5 years, maybe almost 3 now. The domain is still obviously held by Fred's Park, but I have no idea if there's a copy of the site around. And I want to say there must have been somewhere on the order of 100 or 2 poets that were writing on that site. I mean, was not a small body of work. I had 1,800 by myself. And I think at one time, I think I had maybe about 10% of the poems on the entire site. So if I had 1,800, that means there must have been about 18,000 poems on that site. That's a lot of work to lose. That's a lot of literary history to lose. Uh, so I backed up Jeanine's work, and I'm going to send it to her family. I've done um, a little bit of a tribute website for her on Blogger. A memorial to my friend. That's all I can do from this far away. That's the other thing about the internet. Sometimes you don't find out that somebody's passed away for months. Sometimes you might just never find out. You don't know because somebody's on the other side of the world. How do you know? And I have no idea if these people's families have their poems, copies of any of their work. I mean, I know Willowdown passed away in Taiwan, and he was from the UK. That's another one, another international boundary crossed by poetry. I mean, Willowdown was writing fantastical poems, like really mystical stuff. And he was over in Taiwan, and it was like 6 months before I knew anything had happened. It's just I hadn't heard from him in a while. That happens with poets. I mean, you go through a dry spell. You don't write for a while. You get busy with other parts of your life, and you can't write, and you can't spend time online. Then along comes Facebook and Twitter and all that kind of stuff, and that eats up time. It's not the same as it was in the 90s because there's all this other social media and all the distractions. I don't think we live life quite at the depth we used to, but it's a wider life now, wider and shallower in some ways. I don't know. By the same token, there's an important story to be told there, and there's a huge body of work that's greatly at risk of being lost. A lot of these poets' work is still online, and maybe some of them have been passed on to the poets' families. I don't know. But, it kind of worries me. It does. It worries me, and I can name off, I know there's an awful lot of sites that have been around. Poets Against the War I named, lightverse.com, that's gone. Mystic Muse on proboards.com is one that I go. I'm the only person that goes there anymore. I don't think another poet has been on that site in a year and a half. Thankfully, there's a large archive of my poetry on there, and I'm recovering it and moving it over to Spellbook from there because I don't know. I'm hoping that my activity on the site by going there and posting a new poem occasionally, and there's like with the poetry boards, there might be one for general poetry, one for romance, one for dark poetry, there might be like a little, just a cafe, just chit-chat room in there. There might be one for graphic images. There's various sub-boards on these main poetry boards. Almost all of them had that kind of feature. And with Mystic Muse, even if I don't have a poem to share on there, I'll go in the cafe every now and then and just put a note. I put a post in there few years ago called Last Light in the Window, and I go in there every now and then and just kind of flip the switches and stuff to hopefully keep the board alive, because I'm not the only poet who has work archived there. Then I know at least 2 of the poets that had published work on there are gone, dead, passed away. And I don't know if their work exists in too many other places. That would be Ivor and Willowdown. I'm pretty sure Ivor's work is published in about at least 4 different Yuku boards and Mystic Muse. I can't be the only one that has to wonder about this, but it's not just about my work. It's not just about any one poet's work. It's about the history of online poetry, and it's about the body of work that all of us have created together. And I think the romantic poets and the beat poets had their followers. They didn't have the competition from radio and TV so much that we do today. And you know, in the intervening time, we had competition as poets from radio and TV, and we also have had that shift over to competition from TV and social media for attention, for people's attention. I think there's less people that read longer works now, and there's less people that read what might seem kind of whimsical or frivolous to some. But I don't think poetry is so frivolous. Sure, some of it is, but some of it can be pretty deep, a pretty raw or deep or eloquent discussion of the human condition and current events in the world. For instance, Poets Against the War, that's one example. But just, you know, larger events that affect the global and local national cultures are reflected in poetry. And poetry is often about how those events make people feel more than the specifics of the events themselves. So it captures a little bit of the emotional history of humanity more so than the factual history of humanity. And I think that's one of the things that's important about poetry, be it online or written. We have a sense of the Victorian mindset because of the Romance poets. We have a sense of the culture in the 20th century when the beat poets were writing in California because their work was preserved. So to any internet poets out there, save your work, make sure that your family knows where to save it, and also save the history of poetry online as you know it. Record it, talk about it. What sites have you gone to? What kind of things have happened? And I'm planning on doing a longer series on this kind of stuff, but I just wanted to get this down. I wanted to get this video down and get a sense of things going here. I know I'm a little bit rambling right now because it's like 2:30 in the morning. I'm tired. I've been working on a lot of other stuff, but this is weighing on my mind, especially with Jeanine passing away this past week, Willow down, you know, a little less than a year ago, Maggie less than a year ago. The stuff, everything is ephemeral. Everything in life is ephemeral, and poetry recognizes that a lot of times. And there's some interesting kind of things too with poetry that happens. A lot of times you'll see 2 or 3 or 4 poets write on very, very, very closely related subjects and post them at the same time. Sorry, on the same poetry board. You know, so to me it kind of speaks to the subconscious connection, the quantum connection between all of us, because I think our subconscious operates on the quantum level in this universe. So I think there's a well we all tap into. And I think poetry kind of exposes that a little bit sometimes. But if you've got some history to share, if you know about online poetry sites that you've been to, record it, talk about it, share it, and maybe we can kind of put that and patch it all together and get some kind of a sense of the history of web poetry, especially in its early days. And with that, I'm going to have to say goodnight, and I'll bring it back around another time. But this is the overarching story that I'm trying to tell.